Imagine a cold, cloudy day when a new chapter in the history of Europe was about to be written. The wind blew hard through the streets of Brussels, the capital of Belgium, while the news spread like wildfire. The king had passed away. The old monarch, Leopold I, the founder of modern Belgium, was leaving the throne to his son, an ambitious, determined and still unknown man to many. His name, Leopold II. He was only 30 years old and had a spirit of conquest that would make him one of the most controversial figures in history. But before we dive into this fascinating journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment on what you think of this story. Let's keep going. Leopold II ascended the throne of Belgium in 1865, following the death of his father Leopold I, the first king of Belgium. This was a pivotal moment, not only for the future of Belgium, but also for the history of the European continent. When Leopold II assumed the throne, he was still young and full of grandiose dreams. His father Leopold I had been a respected monarch, but Leopold II had a different vision for the country's future. He wanted not only to maintain Belgium's stability and status, he wanted to expand the nation's power and make it stand out on the international stage. But like any story of a new king, the ascension to the throne was not without its challenges. Belgium at the time was a small country compared to its more powerful neighbors, such as France, Germany, and Great Britain. Belgium had only recently gained its independence in 1830 after a series of revolts, and the country was still building its national identity. King Leopold II knew he would need something big to put Belgium on the map, something that would make him remembered as a monarch who not only kept the peace, but who also led his nation into a new era of power and influence. However, circumstances at the beginning of his reign were difficult. The country was experiencing economic growth, but it was still heavily dependent on the great European powers. Unlike other countries, Belgium did not have large colonies or vast territories abroad. It was a small nation with a population that, despite being proud, had to fight every day for its place in the sun. And this was what Leopold II saw as an opportunity. He wanted more, not only for himself, but for his nation. Soon he began to look abroad, to distant lands where Belgium could expand its influence. It was there that he began to dream of an empire, and it was in this quest for power that he found a unique opportunity, the Congo in Africa. But before we get to the crucial role that the Congo played in his history, it is important to understand how Leopold II used his power to create a personal empire, one that would never be forgotten. Through his political cunning and persuasion, Leopold II managed to convince international leaders that the Congo Free State, a personal colony under his control, would be a humanitarian mission. But behind these promises of civilization and development lurked a relentless pursuit of wealth, a power that he believed would place Belgium among the great powers of the world. And so, little by little, Leopold II began to shape the destiny of a small country, but with an ambition that would make all of Europe tremble. After his accession to the throne, and with his eyes fixed on a great future for Belgium, Leopold II set about taking action. He knew that Belgium, despite its growing industrial economy, did not possess the vast natural resources or colonies that larger empires did. While other European nations were expanding their territories, exploiting lands in Asia and Africa, Leopold II hatched an audacious plan. If he could not conquer the world with a vast army, he would conquer it with intelligence and persuasion. It was through his diplomatic skills that in 1876, Leopold II managed to secure control of a vast region in Central Africa without firing a single bullet. He organized a series of expeditions and conferences, where he presented himself as a champion of civilization and progress for the African people. In doing so, he secured the approval of several European powers and, more importantly, the promise of support for what would be his greatest project, the Congo Free State. The story of how Leopold II convinced the world to give him this vast tract of land in near-secret fashion is a true spectacle of political persuasion. What seemed like a brilliant diplomatic achievement soon turned out to be a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. The Congo Free State was not an official Belgian colony, but rather the king's personal possession. This meant that he had complete control over the land and its riches without being answerable to any Belgian government or law. Rather than simply administering the region prudently, Leopold II treated the Congo as a vast mine of natural resources, especially rubber, which was in high demand due to the Industrial Revolution. What followed was one of the darkest and cruelest stories of imperialism. In order to extract rubber, Leopold II implemented a brutal regime of forced labor. Men, women, and children were forced to work long hours in inhumane conditions. Anyone who failed to meet the production quotas set by the king was severely punished with torture, mutilation, and even death. What was promoted as a project of civilization became, in reality, a silent massacre, with estimates that between 10 and 15 million Congolese lost their lives during Leopold II's rule. And this massacre did not happen far from the eyes of the world. Contrary to what the king imagined, the brutality of the regime began to be exposed by journalists, missionaries, and activists, especially after the reports of figures such as Edmond de Morel and the famous writer Mark Twain. They denounced the horrors that were being committed, and this generated a large international movement to pressure Leopold II to cede control of the Congo. The images and reports of the atrocities in the Congo began to tarnish the reputation of the king and Belgium, eventually forcing the Belgian government to take action. In 1908, after decades of international pressure and scandal, Leopold II was forced to hand over the Congo to Belgium, which then turned the region into an official colony. But the damage had already been done. The Congo would continue to suffer under Belgian colonial rule, but the scars left by Leopold II's actions would never be erased. While he still enjoyed great power and wealth in Belgium, his international reputation was forever ruined. Yet in the heart of Belgium, Leopold II's reign also had its construction side. Money extracted from the Congo was used to finance major projects in Belgium, such as the development of new buildings, parks, and infrastructure. However, while Belgium was filled with new monuments and wide streets, the Congo, which was supposed to be a symbol of its greatness, became a nightmare that would mark history with a legacy of suffering. Now you can probably imagine the impact these events had on the generations that followed. What did Leopold II leave behind for Belgium and the Congo? How did history deal with a monarch who, on the one hand, built a nation and, on the other, destroyed lives in another part of the world? Now that we understand Leopold II's rise to the Belgian throne and his ambitions that led to his control of the Congo, we need to look at the legacy he left behind, both in Belgium and the Congo. His vision of greatness and dominion was not limited to the conquest of lands, but extended to the way he wanted to be remembered. While Belgium prospered under his rule, the Congo became a wasteland. But did Leopold II ultimately achieve what he set out to do? The answer is complex, and his legacy is one of the most controversial in modern history. Let's start with Belgium. During the reign of Leopold II, the country underwent a dramatic transformation in terms of infrastructure. The king, with his great wealth accumulated in the Congo, invested heavily in the development of large urban and public projects. He financed the construction of roads, monuments, museums, hospitals, and the famous Leopold Park in Brussels, which bears his dynasty's name. His vision was to create a city that reflected the power and prestige of Belgium, and indeed, many of these works are still visible and appreciated today. The new urban landscape of Brussels was one of the most tangible legacies of his reign. Belgium, small but powerful, was seen as a nation that was modernizing, becoming an economic powerhouse in its own right. However, parallel to this development in Belgium, there was a very different reality in the Congo. What Leopold II did in administering the land as his personal property was something that defied any notion of humanity and dignity. Forced labor, cruel punishments, mutilations, and the deaths of millions of Congolese people became the true face of his rule in the Congo. However, the horrors of the Congo Free State were not confined to the pages of books or the accounts of activists. They spread, reaching the consciences of people around the world, and international pressure was soon mounting. It was this pressure from journalists, missionaries, human rights activists, and even other governments that forced Leopold II to cede the Congo to Belgium in 1908. This represented one of the greatest victories in the fight against colonial abuses of the time. What had begun as Leopold II's personal empire was eventually transformed into a Belgian colony, with the Belgian government taking direct control of the administration of the region. But the change in administration did not erase the horrors that had occurred during Leopold II's personal reign. The transition did not mean immediate recovery for the Congolese people, who would continue to suffer under Belgium's colonial policies, but now under a new type of government. However, even with the loss of the Congo, King Leopold II continued to live a life of luxury and prestige. He was still adored by many Belgians who saw his reign as an era of greatness for the country, mainly because of the projects he had financed. However, for the rest of the world, Leopold II's name was associated with one of the worst colonial tragedies in history. In Brussels and other Belgian cities, monuments to Leopold II began to stand as symbols of a memory that is hard to swallow. Even though Belgium had benefited from the wealth that the Congo brought, there was a growing awareness of the human cost of that prosperity. Over time, the figure of Leopold II became increasingly controversial. In the 21st century, protests began to take place against his statues, with groups demanding that they be removed as a way of acknowledging the horrors of his exploitation in the Congo. And this brings us to a very important question. How can history deal with figures like Leopold II? How can we reconcile the idea of a monarch who brought great benefits to his nation, but also caused unimaginable suffering in another part of the world? The answer to this question is challenging, because it requires us to look at history with critical eyes and be willing to face the complexity of legacies. Leopold II, for all his greatness and cruelty, is an example of how power and ambition can create monuments of glory as well as monuments of pain. And here we come to the lasting impact of his reign in the Congo. The tragedy that unfolded under his rule was not only a stain on the history of Belgium, but also a deep wound in the history of the African continent. The scars of colonialism, exploitation, and oppression continue to be felt to this day. The Congo, after years of suffering, would continue to fight for its independence and identity, with the scars left by Leopold II and his Belgian successors being a constant reminder that the legacies of an empire can be both heavy and lasting. And as we continue to reflect on the global impact of Leopold II's reign, it's important to consider how the world remembers historical figures. Will he be remembered as a monarch who made Belgium a prosperous nation, or as a tyrant whose actions in the Congo led to the deaths of millions of people? The story of Leopold II is one that stirs up conflicting emotions. While many in Belgium still saw the king as a monarch who brought prosperity and modernization to the country, the shadow of his actions in the Congo never left them. The way Belgium has dealt with Leopold II's legacy over the years is a reflection of how societies can often ignore or even minimize past mistakes when those mistakes are uncomfortable or painful to confront. In the years after the cession of the Congo to Belgium, Leopold II remained a controversial figure. In his own homeland, many were more focused on the development he had brought about in terms of infrastructure and modernization. The great works financed by his wealth, such as museums, palaces, and the creation of urban parks, were still there, visible in Brussels and other parts of the country. However, these achievements began to be overshadowed as the memory of the atrocities in the Congo spread around the world. In the 1920s, with Leopold II now dead, international pressure to acknowledge colonial abuses began to mount. But rather than address the guilt and legacy of the atrocities in the Congo, Belgium chose to focus on national pride and internal stability. For a long time, the Belgian government did little to directly address the suffering of millions of Congolese under the king's rule. Indeed, the history of the Congo under Leopold II was for many years ignored or downplayed in Belgian history books. The silence surrounding Congo's brutal past was broken most dramatically after the end of World War II, when the decolonization movement began to gain momentum around the world. African colonies began to seek independence, and Congo was no exception. In 1960, Congo finally gained its independence from Belgium. This moment was, in large part, a chance to come to terms with the past, but also to seek a different future. Congo's independence was an important milestone, but the divide between Belgium's legacies and the Congolese people's struggle for autonomy and dignity remains an open wound. In recent years, especially in the 21st century, Belgium has begun to face up to its role in the suffering caused by Leopold II's regime in the Congo. Social movements and activists have begun to demand the removal of statues of Leopold II in Belgian cities, arguing that these tributes should not be seen as symbols of glory, but rather as painful reminders of a past of exploitation and cruelty. In Brussels, where a statue of Leopold II stood for many years, the discussion about the king's legacy has become a major public debate that has divided opinion. Some argued that the statues represented an important moment in Belgian history, but most felt that it was no longer acceptable to continue to commemorate a monarch whose actions had resulted in such immense suffering for so many people. The statues of Leopold II, while seen by some as a symbol of greatness, became a symbol of resistance for those who wanted to see a deeper recognition of the atrocities committed under his rule. This movement culminated in actions such as the removal of statues in several Belgian cities. Today, the impact of Leopold II's actions in the Congo continues to be a subject of study and debate. Belgian historians, activists and politicians are still grappling with the heavy legacy he left behind. The Congo, with its history marked by centuries of colonial exploitation, still bears the scars of oppression, and memories of Leopold II's regime remain alive among younger generations who demand justice and recognition for their suffering. It is important to remember that history is not just about the great deeds of a monarch or the monuments he built, but also about the suffering that his pursuit of power and wealth caused to the people who were exploited and oppressed. Leopold II, like other colonial leaders of his time, sought glory for his country and for himself, but the price for this was paid by many, whose lives were marked by violence, exploitation and death. Now that we have gone through all these twists and turns, the question remains, how should we remember and deal with historical figures like Leopold II? Should we celebrate their achievements and turn a blind eye to the damage they caused, or should we look at the past with a critical lens, acknowledging the failures and mistakes made so that we can build a more just and conscious future? The story of Leopold II teaches us that however much the power of a monarch or the greatness of a nation may be celebrated, the atrocities committed in the name of that power must never be forgotten. The struggle for truth, memory and justice continues, and Belgium, like other colonial nations, still faces the challenge of reconciling its past with its present. And so, while Belgium continues to grapple with the legacy of Leopold II, the finally independent Congo searches for its own voice and identity, grappling with the scars of a painful past. In the end, the story of Leopold II is more than just the story of a king. It is the story of a people, a continent and an era of exploration that still echoes today. The story of Leopold II, as we have seen, is marked by a complex and deeply painful legacy. But when we look more closely, we realize that the impact of his actions is not limited to the historical events of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The reverberations of his choices and the suffering he caused the Congolese people continue to influence the politics and collective memory of many countries to this day. The way in which Belgium, Europe and indeed the world have dealt with his legacy shows how a nation can, for so long, hide or minimize the dark side of its history, until finally the pressure for justice and truth becomes impossible to ignore. While the Congo fought for its freedom in 1960 with independence finally achieved, the effects of Leopold II's actions were still being felt. The Belgian colony, even after the transition to direct Belgian rule, remained a place marked by exploitation and violence, something that continued for decades. The new state of Congo, although freed from the clutches of Leopold II, would continue to face economic and political challenges that stemmed directly from the colonial policies and system imposed by Leopold II. The exploitation of the Congo, its natural wealth, and the oppression inflicted on the population during Leopold II's regime left deep scars that would take generations to heal. Congolese independence, although victorious, did not bring immediate peace. Instead, it was marked by political instability and internal conflicts, exacerbated by the lack of infrastructure, education, and resources for a country that had been plundered. For many years, Congo faced exploitation by foreign companies, often with the tacit support of Western powers, and the wounds left by Belgian colonialism remained a heavy burden to bear. The memory of the atrocities committed during the reign of Leopold II is still present in the hearts of many Congolese who continue to fight for historical reparations and justice. In Belgium, meanwhile, the debate over how to deal with Leopold II's legacy has intensified in recent decades. In 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the global protests against racial inequality forced Belgium to confront its own colonial history more openly and critically. Statues of Leopold II, which had long stood in squares and parks, became controversial symbols of colonial oppression, and many of these statues were removed. The removal of these statues was symbolic of a nation beginning to come to terms with the weight of its colonial past, acknowledging the atrocities committed in the name of its greatness. Despite this, many Belgians still see Leopold II as a figure who modernized the country, bringing wealth and infrastructure. This sense of national pride and nostalgia for his era of prosperity are difficult barriers to overcome for those who fight for the removal of the statues and full acceptance of the country's painful history. There is a clear clash between the desire to acknowledge the suffering inflicted on the Congolese and the desire to maintain a positive image of a king who helped transform Belgium into an industrial powerhouse. The question that still hangs over Belgians and the world is, how do we deal with this legacy? How can we honor the memory of the victims of Leopold II's regime without ignoring the positive impact it had on Belgium in terms of modernization and infrastructure? And most importantly, how can we ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated? One way to address this legacy is through education and awareness. It is vital that future generations understand the horrors of Leopold II's regime and the suffering it caused in the Congo. It is necessary that the history of the Congo Free State, with all its atrocities, is taught in schools, not only in Belgium but globally, so that we can learn from the mistakes of the past and work towards a more just world. Furthermore, historical reparations are an important issue. Congo, like many other nations that suffered under colonialism, still carries the burden of a past that was imposed upon it. Public recognition of the atrocities committed, the removal of statues of Leopold II, and support for projects that promote truth and justice in Congo can be important steps to help repair some of the damage done. However, true reparations go beyond simply removing monuments or apologizing. They require significant changes in international relations and support for the reconstruction and development of countries that still struggle with the consequences of colonialism. As debates about Leopold II's legacy continue, history offers us an important lesson. Power, wealth, and glory should not be acquired at the expense of the humanity and dignity of others. The suffering caused by Leopold II's regime must not be forgotten or minimized. The memory of the victims of the Congo must be preserved, and the story must be told in all its complexity so that we can learn from it and build a better future. As the conversation about Leopold II and the legacy of his era continues, a crucial question arises: how can we ensure that history does not repeat itself, and that, as a society, we can bring justice to those who suffered because of his insatiable pursuit of power and wealth? The path of truth and reconciliation, especially in relation to colonialism, is not simple, but it is essential to healing wounds that are still felt today, both in the Congo and in Belgium. While recognition of the horrors of Leopold II has made significant progress, many questions remain open, such as compensation for the suffering inflicted on the Congolese. This is not just about symbolic recognition, but also about concrete actions that can bring some form of justice to the victims and their families, although nothing can erase the suffering. However, ensuring that future generations understand and are educated about these historical tragedies is one of the most powerful ways to prevent this chapter of exploitation and cruelty from being forgotten. The Congo, after its independence in 1960, found itself in a turbulent territory, marked by a lack of infrastructure, political instability, and the legacy of centuries of exploitation. And although the Belgian government eventually transferred control of the Congo to its own officials, the following decades were not kind. The country experienced a period of internal conflict, political instability, and foreign intervention, elements whose roots are intertwined with the history of colonial rule. The impact of Leopold II on the Congo was not erased by independence, and the process of recovery for the country was much longer and more complex than anyone could have imagined. At the same time, Belgium, while it made significant strides in modernization and infrastructure during Leopold II's reign, also had to deal with the remnants of historical guilt. While the king's great works are still visible in Brussels and other cities, Belgium also saw its own social and political fissures widen as the human cost of that prosperity became clearer. From the late 20th century onwards, and especially with contemporary protests against colonial figures, statues of Leopold II began to be questioned as symbols of an era that cannot be glorified without acknowledging the horrors it wrought. The transformation of the concept of legacy over the years illustrates a significant shift in the way Belgian society views its colonial history. Many in Belgium have begun to see the need to face historical issues more honestly, while the Belgian government has been gradually forced, reluctantly, to engage in discussions about reparations and public recognition. And this reflects a larger global shift, which seeks to acknowledge historical injustices while building a more equitable future. Yet it is important to note that even amid the recognition of Leopold II's atrocities, the impact on the Congolese people is still a lively debate. The suffering of millions of Congolese cannot simply be removed by symbolic actions such as removing statues or issuing government apologies. The healing process requires an ongoing commitment to truth, justice, and perhaps most difficult, reparation. It is not enough to simply remember what happened. It is necessary to ensure that the lessons of the past are applied to the present and the future. Leopold II's legacy is a constant reminder of how stories of power, wealth, and conquest can often be built on the suffering of many. While Congolese people continue to bear the burden of colonial history, Belgium, with its own social complexities, faces the responsibility of acknowledging the damage that was done, not as a burden, but as an opportunity to truly transform society and learn from the past. What will be remembered and what will remain for future generations will undoubtedly be determined by the choices we make now as a society regarding our history. It is from this recognition that we can build a future in which exploitation, oppression, and inequality no longer have a place. Ultimately, the story of Leopold II, with all its complexities and horrors, challenges us to reflect on the narratives we choose to preserve and how those narratives shape the world we live in. As we continue to grapple with the consequences of centuries of colonialism, it is crucial that the story be told truthfully and comprehensively, acknowledging both the triumphs and the mistakes, so that we can move toward a more just and equitable future. Did you like this story? Comment, like, and subscribe to the channel to follow more royal stories.